Let's talk a little bit about Obergefell v. Hodges, where the Supreme Court said the Due Process Clause means same-sex couples have a constitutionally protected right to get married. To really understand the decision, you need to know at least a little bit about the Due Process Clause, so we'll start with that. The 14th Amendment says, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." To some people, all that means is government cannot kill you, confine you, or take your stuff without putting you through some process. So to them, liberty simply means physical freedom in its most basic sense. But most of us would disagree, because for most of us, liberty, our freedom, isn't just about being able to walk around where we want to. It's also about being able to walk around how we want to. Because the Constitution promises liberty to all within its reach. A liberty that includes certain specific rights that allow persons within a lawful realm to define and express their identity. These certain specific rights are called fundamental rights, and they're beyond the government's reach. One of the Supreme Court's roles has for a long time been to identify these rights. The most straightforward fundamental rights to identify are those that are actually in the Constitution, like the fundamental right to freedom of speech. Other fundamental rights are based on history and tradition, like the right to marital privacy. Up until 1965, some states had laws banning birth control, so even married couples couldn't be on the pill. But the Supreme Court said the Due Process Clause means states cannot do that, because whether or not a married couple uses birth control is their decision to make in the privacy of their marriage. And those sort of decisions have always been beyond the government's reach. So the court identified the fundamental right to marital privacy based on a history and tradition of marital privacy. Other fundamental rights are based on the Supreme Court's reasoned judgment, like the fundamental right to marry. Up until 1967, America had an uninterrupted history and tradition of banning interracial marriage. White people could only marry other white people. But the Supreme Court, in its reasoned judgment, recognized that marriage is one of the basic civil rights of man, fundamental to our very existence and survival. And so for a people to really be free, they have to have the right to decide who they're going to marry. Liberty means government cannot stop a white woman from marrying a black man in spite of history and tradition. Now, let's get back to same-sex marriage. The Constitution doesn't say anything about marriage, much less same-sex marriage, so most of those opposed to it point to history and tradition to argue that as far back as history goes, across time and cultures, marriage has always been between a man and a woman. History and tradition, they say, couldn't be more against same-sex marriage. But the court said it wouldn't be right to rely on history and tradition when it comes to same-sex marriage, because homosexuality was classified a mental illness in America until 1973, and until 2003, states could and some did criminalize sex for gays and lesbians. So of course there'd be no history and tradition of same-sex marriage when consummating it would have been a crime. But now that we know sexuality is not a defect, it wouldn't be right to rely on a history and tradition that's always assumed it was. So instead, the Supreme Court relied on its reasoned judgment. It identified 4 reasons why marriage is a fundamental right and found that all of them also apply to same-sex couples. 1. Liberty is the freedom to be who you want to be, and the right to decide who you're going to marry is inherent in the concept of individual autonomy. It's one of the most intimate decisions you'll ever make, and it will shape the course of your life. You wouldn't really be free if government could stop you from marrying someone based on the color of their skin. So how can you say that you're free if government can stop you from marrying someone based on their gender? 2. Marriage supports a 2-person union unlike anything else. It's not just a contract between 2 people, it's intimately more. 2 individuals identified by their commitment to each other. A commitment that survives death. James Obergefell was fighting to be recognized as John Arthur's surviving spouse. They were together over 20 years and were married in Maryland in 2013. But John Arthur died a single man because he lived and died in Ohio, and Ohio didn't recognize same-sex marriages. But even in death, James Obergefell identified by his commitment to John Arthur, and he wanted that commitment recognized just as much as you or I would. 3. Marriage legitimizes families. When you're married, no one asks whose kid is this, and children don't suffer the stigma of feeling as if their families are somehow lesser. April DeBear and Jane Rouse committed to each other in a civil ceremony in 2007 and have since grown their family through adoption. But April and Jane live in Michigan where only individuals or opposite-sex couples could adopt, meaning each of their kids legally had only one parent. So in an emergency, the cops or a hospital would have had to treat the kid's other mother as if she were a stranger. And 4. Marriage is a keystone of American social order. You can tell how important it is by all the bundle of rights that comes attached to it. Society encourages marriage. These are the things that make marriage a fundamental right. Up until now, same-sex couples have been excluded from this right. But that's because up until now, gays and lesbians were seen as criminals who needed treatment. But the Supreme Court, in its reasoned judgment, decided now that we know better, we can no longer deny to same-sex couples their fundamental right to marry. There are those who say same-sex marriage is the sort of thing that should have been left to the democratic process. The Supreme Court should have let people keep voting on it. More and more states were legalizing same-sex marriage, so the democratic process was working, they say. But if the law of the land is majority rules, then the Supreme Court is the last champion of minority rights. And so if the Supreme Court fails to act, then minority rights will be trampled. For example, in 1986, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of laws criminalizing sex for gays and lesbians, leaving the issue for the democratic process. But the democratic process never resolved it, and so the Supreme Court left it so consenting adults could get sent to prison for having sex. The court was asked to reconsider it in 2003, and that's when they finally decided government cannot tell you how or who would you have sex. And they even admitted that's how they should have decided the case in '86. And so for 17 years, gay and lesbian rights were trampled because the court didn't stop it, and there was no one left to help them. That's why the Supreme Court cannot wait on the democratic process when a minority's rights are being trampled. And there you have it. Now you know a little bit about how and why the Supreme Court said same-sex couples have the same constitutional right to marry as the rest of us. As always, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you learned something. And until next time, take it easy, everyone.